Let's look at a bit of details on how one of the command-based policies worked in the US. It's the so-called CAFE, or Corporate Average Fuel Economy standards, that came into effect way back in the 1970s, when the oil crisis created massive problems of infinitely long lines and so on in the US, and that was just coming out of the gas guzzler muscle cars that we will look at in a minute. So if you look from that period onwards, the emissions from transportation has gone up. There is some drop here because of adjustments in the way people bought cars and the financial crisis that happened as well. And from the electric power, actually it has dropped more recently because of the expanding renewable portfolio joining the overall electricity production. Okay, so those are the kind of the context. Transportation still remains a recalcitrant sector in terms of emissions reductions. So the corporate average fuel economy limits were set for different vehicle types, and obviously you can see cars, trucks, light duty vehicles, and so on. And the actual fuel economy of the cars did jump up after the oil crisis. People went to smaller cars. Companies started, the manufacturers started to offer more choices of smaller cars. So you can see a impressive jump to from below almost below 15, close to 10, 11 miles per gallon to more than 25 here. Remained flat for a while, even as the fuel economy improved, because there are times when fuel economies improve but people switch to bigger cars because of drops in oil prices, or moving to the suburbs and so-called soccer moms which need bigger cars, or just the preferences and the utility, the value they see in having a bigger car in the absence of, let's say, efficient and effective public transportation and so on. So Obama tried to pump up the fuel economy standards. As we said, Trump has tried to kick them down and so on. So there are many factors involved in that, and it has been not a very great success in terms of reducing emissions. So this is used as another example of why regulation-based policy is not very effective in driving overall cost effectiveness, despite creating a lot of exceptions. Okay, because individual actions like preferences for cars and so on can make a big difference, and externalities like gasoline price can make a huge difference as well. Even as global warming is being talked about more and more, and emissions and air pollution are increasing, the sales of SUVs have gone up. Okay, here are some ideas on income distribution and gasoline use. It's often noted that overall gasoline use in the United States does not respond very rapidly to gasoline price, because people are locked in, and people are locked into their preferences as well. So the carbon tax needed in that case would be very large. And then the additional thing you have to remember is that the location of people's homes to the number and size of highways. So if you build good roads to suburbs and its commute time is very small, people may just prefer to live in the suburbs and drive in, commute every day to work and so on. Even school buses run long routes, for example. Shopping malls drive driving habits. So it's important to note that all things a carbon tax would eventually affect, like housing sprawl, parking garages, and so on, are important. So even necessary, as they say, but there is a time scale involved. By the time you impose a carbon tax, and by the time builders and developers notice it and offer better choices, can be long and can add plenty of emissions in the meantime anyways. What are the implications of having small short-term responses in transportation infrastructure? Carbon taxes, when they are passed through into gasoline, may be mostly unavoidable in the short term before housing option and infrastructure design start to change. Lower income households will also suffer, which is unavoidable in the short term. So the ideal economic solution would be to, at the same time a carbon tax is imposed, you offer some benefits to the low income households to make up for the increased tax burden. So carbon dividend in the form of a basic income can be proposed, as we saw in the letter written by the economists to the Wall Street Journal. Concerns surrounding inequality of gasoline taxation, which is a big aspect of carbon taxation, have been subject of much research in the economics. As we saw, it's a question of whether to reduce tax rates or to give dividends back. So if you have a US household earning between $25,000 and $50,000 in annual income, they consume about 800 gallons of gasoline per year, whereas next bracket, income bracket of 50,000 to 75,000 consumes about 1,100 gallons per year. So the jump is not proportional. So if you had carbon tax of $1.40 per ton, it works out to be 35 cents per gallon of gasoline. So it would cost a low-income household $2.80 per year versus a higher income household of only $3.85. So the proportional amount you spend of the total income would be higher for a lower income. But if you take that dividend revenue from carbon tax and split it equally as proposed by the Wall Street letter, then each family would get $332.50 dividend check. So the lower income family which spent $280 would actually gain $52.50, whereas the upper income family would pay overall $52.50. Okay, so the key challenge for a dividend system like the one above is then there are differences between households that have the same level of income. So just because you made between 50 and 75,000 and you used 1,100 gallons of gasoline, you shouldn't be forced to pay more, because there are some that could be using 1,600 gallons per year, and the tax and dividend system would be very hard on them. They only get $332.50 back, whereas they spent $560. So the average doesn't indicate the disparity within the same income group. All right, so this is another thing to worry about. Okay, so the most important advantage of a tax relative to a command-based rule still is that in terms of managing equity concerns that the tax revenue produces, it's still easier. The revenue can be used to help households that are most affected by the policy. Command-based system, for example, banning traditional gasoline and requiring hybrid or electric drive would be also very burdensome for a low-income household. So in the tax forms in the US, you can put in the expense of driving if you're running a private business. That doesn't obviously work for somebody like me who has a salaried job, but command-based rule obviously wouldn't raise government revenue, and the dividends and other programs to help reduce the impact of disadvantaged group, in that case of command-based policies, would then need additional funds, so the government would have to subsidize it somehow by other means. Okay, so forcing people to buy hybrid and electric vehicles would not necessarily solve the problem of inequities in that case. Okay, so long story short, it's still a strong argument in this chapter for market-based, especially carbon tax approach to increasing cost effectiveness of a policy to reduce emissions, to incentivize emissions and ensure cost effectiveness.